There. Now, what'd that tell you?
Joel McCrea, Laraine Day, Herbert Marshall, George Sanders, Albert Vasserman, Robert Benchley.
Welcome to another episode of Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Leszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Hello.
This is a special episode because we have no guest. We had so many wonderful guests recently that we grew accustomed to it, but today it's just the two of us, but we have a very special treat for you. This is the 24th episode, and we are finally talking about the movie that actually gave the title to our podcast, Foreign Correspondent, singular. Made in 1940, released very soon after Rebecca. This film wasn't produced for David O. Selznick, it was for producer Walter Wanger, and we will tell you a little bit more about it. This is a film that I like a lot, and I assume that Sebastian likes it a lot too.
Yes, of course. Spy stories are the best.
Yes, a film very much of its time, a thriller in a Hitchcock mode with a character not unlike the main characters of 39 Steps, let's say, this time played by Joel McCrea. However, with an added component of wartime propaganda. This is a film of 1940 and World War II is already in progress, and this film in a way was a propaganda effort to make the American isolationists reconsider their position, and we will talk about that as well. We last time on this podcast we discussed Rebecca and with Professor Patricia White, and it's important to remember that these two films were released almost simultaneously. They actually competed in the Oscar race of 1940, so I would say that Hitchcock arrived in Hollywood with a bang. He had two films in the Oscar competition immediately after his arrival. One of them, Rebecca, won the Best Picture, and those two films in a way couldn't be more different from one another, because Rebecca really has nothing to do with the mode of a slightly comical breakneck speed thriller that Foreign Correspondent is. And I would say that if I were a film goer of that time, I would say that probably I would definitely like Foreign Correspondent more, because I would recognize the Hitchcock that I already saw in the British films. We will also try to comment a little bit on the wartime propaganda context, especially since this film takes place at the beginning of the World War II, or it's being made at the beginning of the World War II, which started by Germany attacking Poland on the 1st September of 1939, and we are always trying to provide you some Eastern European perspective on things. Poland is even mentioned in the dialogues, by the way. So what is your initial take on this film?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's awesome. We can finally record an episode that has the same title as our podcast itself, which is very cool. And also, as you mentioned, Poland is there as a reference. And of course, I think this movie is especially interesting when we try to approach it from this Eastern European perspective, because of course Hitchcock was almost always interested in Western and Central Europe, and his British movies also they are set either in UK or somewhere in the Balkans, right, which were also a very hot place. And actually there is this joke in Foreign Correspondent, right, when two letters from the neon disappear, they fall down from the neon on the top of the hotel, and instead of Hotel Europe we see Hot Europe, which is one of these you could say political messages that are put there in the movie. But I think it's quite interesting how different countries, Western countries of course, perceive the beginning of the war, and it's very much connected with the idea of how film history actually looks like, right? Because from our perspective, obviously, if a movie was made in 1940, then it was made during the war, of course, right? And I think British perspective is that war started more or less probably at the beginning of the 1940 or maybe late 1939, right, for them, because that's when they decided to say to Germany that, yes, we have a war. And of course, American perspective is even more different, right? This 1941, for Americans, actually, for them, World War II starts in 1941. What comes before is the long period of Churchill kind of trying to court Roosevelt, trying to persuade him to give him more support to enter the war, right? And so it's also interesting period in film history. Of course, in Poland in the years 1949, 1945, we virtually had no film industry. Only some filmmakers who emigrated or who were with war troops were shooting some documentaries, right? Or some filmmakers who emigrated to the West were making movies there. But basically, there's not much to talk about. And of course, in US, it's the opposite, right? It's this pretty amazing period. And still, I would say, problematic for film historians when Hollywood finally, if it ever had one, but it finally loses innocence, or so-called innocence. From 1940, 1941 on, these ties between government and film industry are very close. And that's the context for Foreign Correspondent, one of the contexts at least, because we have a socially engaged producer that you mentioned, Walter Wonger, who was, when I was reading about him, I was thinking about Stanley Kramer a decade later, right? This producer who actually makes some kind of message movies, who wants to have his movies as close to reality as possible. And if we have this tension between David O. Selznick and Hitchcock, and Selznick wanted Hitchcock movies to be more into psychology, woman's perspective, etc. And Hitchcock was the one who was thinking about visual devices and extravagant camera setups. That was the tension, that was the basic tension in Rebecca. And here we have a tension between Hitchcock, who actually extends his British period, makes another thrilling spy story, but the producer is the one who wants to have it closer to reality, who wants to almost include headlines in the movie. And he finally succeeds, because also the story of the production of this film is the story of the war as well. A lot of happens during this time. 1940 is a very transformative year in the war. Actually, World War II is in a full swing. 1940. The British are very much engaged in the war, and so on and so on. And we have this British director working in Hollywood who somehow needs to respond to that in a certain way, right? It's not his personal movie. It's very much, as I mentioned, the tension between different filmmakers who worked on this one, right? The producer, also the art designer, and Hitchcock and his scriptwriting crew. But in a way, you can see that it's a movie made by a British guy. It somehow goes deeply into this European conflicts of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very interesting the way in which Hitchcock is trying to enter the war conversation, especially since he is being treated as a deserter by many, including his former boss and friend Michael Balcon, who publishes a piece criticizing Hitchcock for deserting the United Kingdom in the time of war. He is very unkind towards Hitchcock, saying that he basically chose the comforts of Hollywood over fighting over the home front. It's also interesting that we commented in the previous episodes on the almost cartoonish depiction of Eastern and Central Europe by Hitchcock in a film like Lady Vanishes, for example, in which basically Central Europeans are treated as those funny guys with mustaches and who speak in incredibly absurd languages, and who are being gazed upon by those two British guys who are quite aloof from all this tumult of the Balkans, let's say. And I think I don't think that Hitchcock had much understanding of what was happening in this part of the world. He even includes a cartoonish character of Latvian, played by Edward Conrad in foreign correspondent who speaks funny language and suddenly is fascinated by Scottish kilts. So I think that for Hitchcock, who here even goes as far, and he was not alone in this, as to use fictional language and fictional country Borovia to illustrate that Europe is this messy area where partisanship and nationalisms and shady spy deals are rampant, and this is this film presents its main character, Johnny Jones, played by Joel McCrea, as this no-nonsense reporter who is basically needed in order to go to Europe without any understanding of what's going there. His boss actually sees this as an advantage, that he doesn't have any clue. So his ignorance is his qualification to to make sense of this messy Europe. And it's very charming because, of course, it's very charming conceit, to have this American innocent come and simply tell it how it is, set the record straight. But on the other hand, if you come from these parts, you may feel a little bit queasy, I would say, at sometimes, because first of all, this film completely avoids mentioning Nazi Germany's main collaborator at the time, which was Soviet Russia, because that was after the non-aggression pact of Ribbentrop-Molotov, and in 1940, Soviet Russia was actually Nazi Germany's ally, and Poland was invaded on 1st of September from the west by Nazi Germany, and it was invaded from the east on the 17th of September. So, but of course, Hollywood, which was very much under the spell of Soviet Russia throughout the 30s, never mentioned this. They were in shock. They didn't know how to make a sense of this collaboration between Stalin and Hitler, so they decided not to refer to it at all. So this film mentions Hitler, but of course it doesn't mention Stalin. They were almost relieved when in May 1941 Nazi Germany breached the pact, attacked Soviet Russia, and then Hollywood was breathing the collective breath of relief. Oh, finally we know, yes, Russia is good again. So if you remember that, and if you remember what was happening in these parts, the brutality of both German and Soviet soldiers, you may be a little bit skeptical towards this very naive view of the war, and to the very naive view that there's this one older pacifist here, Van Meer, played by Albert Basserman, who was actually nominated for an Academy Award for this part, that he is the treasury of wisdom. Basically the film says, had European politics been entrusted to men like this, those wise pacifists, those wise politicians, then everything would be all right. Well, we know that that's not exactly the case. Having said that, and having also acknowledged that as the Criterion essay, because this film, by the way, just like Rebecca, was released by Criterion, so we can watch it in an excellent quality, that even Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Nazi Germany, admitted that this was a great propaganda film. So I don't even want to mention all those political naivete, because I think it's there. However, I think it's an excellent film that definitely had to make American viewers at the time really think, should we get involved? And this will be throughout the war, actually. Even in Casablanca, you have a character of Rick who wants to stay neutral but needs to engage, finally. And here, I think it's a brilliant conceit, and especially because of how beautifully and seamlessly it's interwoven into this very established formula of Hitchcock thriller, because basically this film proves that this formula is so tight and so it works so well on a basic level that it can be easily, it's just a matter of switching the MacGuffin. Mm-hmm. If the MacGuffin has some political significance, like here, this clause 27 or whatever it is, then suddenly it becomes a machine for important social meaning and political meaning. So take away, or change the MacGuffin here, and the movie wouldn't collapse. The movie would work very well. Maybe you could cut the last speech in which Joel McCrea, by the way, it was written by Ben Hecht, as it turns out, in which Joel McCrea makes this passionate call for action. If you cut this, you just have a joyous, funny American English thriller with Joel McCrea providing the necessary portion of American innocence and George Sanders, who was just in Rebecca, providing the necessary portion of British aloofness and wit as Folliot with a lowercase f. And yeah, it's just wonderful. And this film is extremely expensive. It was very expensive. And for example, the scene, this famous set piece in Amsterdam, of a crowd of people crowding the stairs of I think it's a municipal building or a cathedral or whatever, with umbrellas, and it was the whole Amsterdam set was a set.
It was
So
built in Hollywood.
yeah, so you can tell that Hitchcock has money. He has resources to do those very elaborate special effects, like a plane crashing into the ocean and water crashing through the window shield. So yes, this is Hitchcock working on a big scale. He's not leaving his comfort zone. I think Rebecca was him leaving the comfort zone. Here he is working straight in his comfort zone. It so happens that he involves the war propaganda, which I think he believed in. I think he was a concerned citizen, and he knew that it's important not to stay neutral. And of course, we will talk later on about his further war films like Lifeboat and 2 shorts that he made later on.
I agree with some part of what you said, but I think I'm not sure if this movie is as innocent or, let's say, disinterested in realities as you suggest. Because, for example, when I'm thinking about the Van Meer character, I agree he's shown as this benevolent patriarch, but he's yet another person who doesn't really understand the situation clearly. Actually, he's like, also because he's kidnapped and drugged and so on, he's like a child in a mist, he doesn't really, he doesn't have any agency. And that's I think that's a bleak vision of this film, if we agree this film has a coherent vision. Because I think it's, I agree with you, it's made seamlessly, but I think there is this tension and there are these stitches, between Walter Wonger's newspaper-like approach and Hitchcock's more abstract formula of a spy story, right? It's pretty late. You can make movies like that in the 1930s, like 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes, when the war is still not declared. But when you make a film like that in 1940, when Charlie Chaplin makes The Great Dictator, which is like obviously against Hitler and is a very heavily anti-war movie, Hitchcock is doing something different. He's still providing entertainment with just some clues of, like the reference to the real world. But we have this Van Meer who's really not comprehending the whole situation. Of course, he's an experienced diplomat and he understands more or less what is going on. And he's not hopeful as well. I mean, I think he understands that we are heading towards war. That's the feeling that this movie projects, that no matter what you will do, there will be war. But we also have this interesting character of Mr. Fisher, of course, played by Herbert Marshall, whom we know from previous Hitchcock movies, and who is, I would say, he's great here. He's really quite a menace, I would say. And he's a bit like Kevin Spacey. I think Kevin Spacey, let us say this name in our podcast, I think Kevin Spacey has a similar way of kind of projecting this haunting quality of, something sinister going on there, but at the same time, highly cultured personality and ultimately quite honorable person. So I would say the way he's this part of the plot is resolved, that he's a negative character, he's a spy, but he's, after all, there is some redemption in him, right? He dies and he even sacrifices his life. I think there is this element of naivete in this movie that still we can have these plot devices that will maybe give us this conclusion that maybe we still can resolve some things. Maybe we're not heading towards the disaster, but at the same time, his character, I think, shows us that we are not anymore in this world of 1930s thrillers where there were good guys and there were bad guys. Now we are entering this grayish zone, and maybe it's not really developed in this movie. It's not it's not an existential noir that has this all kinds of shades. But I think that the character of Fisher and the way he's played by Herbert Marshall, he's amazing, really, including his limp, which is used here actually very almost subconsciously. You know, you can sense that also this limp gives him something, some additional feature that makes him a more complicated character. So that's what I think about Foreign Correspondent. That it's quite a fractured movie in many ways, and maybe not as coherent as we would wish. But also, you said that it's a pretty expensive film, and it is. And also nowadays, when we think about Hitchcock, the general story is that, of course, he was pre-planning everything. He had lots of sketches, and he was entering the set, and basically it was like a chess match. Everything was settled before the shooting started, right? That he was, the popular image is that he was in a full control of the film set. Whereas in 1914 Hollywood, he had a totally different opinion about him. He was talked about as a pretty slow director because he extended the schedule when working on Rebecca. There was a number of changes, of course, some of them implemented by Selznick, but basically he was working pretty slow. He was very meticulously preparing every shot and taking his time. And Selznick, for example, was surprised because, after all, Hitchcock, prided himself as this director who is very efficient and who is cutting in the camera, right? That he's not taking this master shots all the time and a big number of close-ups, and then in the cutting room he creates a sequence. No, he has already planned, and it saves both film and time, right? That was the image Hitchcock projected about himself. But Rebecca went over budget a little and was shot for a few more weeks. And similarly, when it comes to Foreign Correspondent, it was a similar situation. It was much more expensive than it was supposed to be, and Hitchcock needed more shooting days. But if you're interested in this production context, what is interesting is that Hitchcock was, of course, loaned by Selznick. So Selznick, as this strong independent producer, who still only had the Selznick International Pictures were pretty small company after all compared to the big studios, but he had great stars on contract, and he was making money just by loaning them, right? So he was making pure cash by loaning Hitchcock, but Hitchcock was happy because the control of Walter Wanger and some other producers that he will work with in the next few years, when still on contract with Selznick, was not as strong. So he had more freedom, and that's why Walter Wanger was fascinated by Hitchcock. He really admired him, and he gave him more free hand than Selznick did. So I think also that's one of the reasons why Foreign Correspondent is so much 1930s Hitchcock projected into early 40s Hollywood. Absolutely.
I don't know if I have anything to add. We can mention the screenwriters, Charles Bennett, who is a collaborator of Hitchcock from the British years, Joan Harrison, who a very important contributor to Hitchcock's work at the time, with some dialogue by Robert Benchley, who was the Algonquin wit, and here plays also correspondent in London that Joel McCrea sees after he arrives. And probably we should also mention William Cameron Menzies, who was a special production effects coordinator. He was a huge influence in the cinema of the 1930s. He directed one of the most famous science fiction films, Things to Come. And here there are so many visual set pieces that are really beautiful, like for example being inside of the turning windmill with all those wheels turning and Joel McCrea trying to navigate them, that are, I would say, spectacular to this day and would be very difficult to achieve in this day and age without computers. So all those things, and including the plane crash and other effects, were designed, and someone actually mentions, I think, on the Criterion disc that it's almost like William Cameron Menzies could be mentioned as co-director of this film, that it was such a big influence. But otherwise, I think yes, I agree with what you said, and I think that it's seeing Hitchcock in a more, I wouldn't say relaxed because it's such a difficult film, but he's in his element here, I would say, and this is a joy to witness.
But I must say, after revisiting Rebecca and now revisiting Foreign Correspondent, I think I was expecting, I was waiting for some more psychologically oriented Hitchcock. I mean, I had great fun watching this film, but I think I agree with, for example, Leonard J. Lev, who wrote this classic book, Hitchcock and Selznick, which covers, of course, collaboration of these two men, but also basically covers the first half of the 1940s. And so also it mentions Hitchcock's collaboration with Wonger. I think I agree with him that it was kind of a throwback in a way, of course, after Rebecca, who maybe Hitchcock didn't consider as his very own film, but still that really stood the test of time very well, even as an old-fashioned melodrama at the moment of its premiere, as we mentioned in the previous episode. But in Foreign Correspondent, I think I was expecting some more, for example, consistency in the character, because there's like half an hour when Joel McCrea actually disappears from the screen almost, and George Saunders, who's great, actually. I mean, I've always liked this actor a lot, so I'm happy he's here, and he's the main protagonist for a period of several scenes. Also, he's the one who has this great stunt. He's jumping from the window, and I'm thinking, well, Joel McCrea should have this moment, this cinematic moment. So, and that's something that Hitchcock I think he will remember that in the future, because when you watch, of course, North by Northwest or Saboteur, he's more consistently staying with the character. He's not just exchanging these puzzles as he likes, right? I mean, I guess he would know later that we need to have more of Joel McCrea and a bit more of his agency, because you're right that the very starting point that we have this innocent journalist, also he's kind of a journalist that likes to quarrel with other people. He's not really professional, in his behavior. He's more of a bit like a gonzo journalist, that he will go there, he will do some tricks, some schemes, to enter, for example, a party or something. So he's one of these, and he's almost fired. He thinks, at the beginning of the movie, he will be fired very soon. So, of course, when, he's played by Joel McCrea, who will very soon be a star of Preston Sturges movies, it gives you this flavor of, maybe a bit of a flavor of this crazy comedy. And of course, this movie, and that's my question to you actually, if you find these scenes convincing, this movie is anchored in this newspaper genre of the 1930s. Do you think it's relevant here? Do you feel it's the beginning of this film, which is set in a press office, do you think it's convincing? It has this flavor of 1930s newspaper comedies?
Yes, I think so. I mean, this is the premise. He's the reporter, and I think he's very professional as a reporter. He's like, I don't know, Clark Gable in It Happened One Night, that he will do anything to get at the bottom of the story, And I think that, we have a very different notions of journalism today, because we know that, in a way, we know that the world is more complicated than it seemed in 1930. But it's here, and the big scene at the end is when he dictates the article, basically by making a speech into a hidden telephone. So yes, this is a story of an article being born, of a piece being born. So I would agree with that. And Joel McCrea is good because he's always puzzled. And this comical quality that Preston Sturges will so beautifully explore, that Joel McCrea always seems like he's on the verge of solving some puzzle that really bugs him. And here his eyes, like he's never fully relaxed. It's like, okay, what's going on here, like what is this stuff, like he's almost saying like an American guy. And I think that works. I think it's always interesting to consider how does Hitchcock administer shock, and how does he use the genuine element of shock? Because suspense is one thing, and fun and games and chasing and stuff. But where is the point of a true shock? Like, of course, in Sabotage, when the little boy blows up, that's truly shocking. The rape scene in Frenzy, that's truly shocking. You cannot laugh at this. It's really a point of shock. Of course, shower scene in Psycho, probably his most famous shocking moment. And I think those shock points in which Hitchcock goes beyond the game and truly packs a punch into your stomach are points where he reveals himself. And here there's one moment when the British lady on the plane starts complaining, what is this nonsense, and she gets shot and killed in 1 second. And I think this is exactly the point of shock, because we wouldn't expect this to happen. She's almost a comical character of this British lady who has no idea. She just wants to have her 5 o'clock tea, and she doesn't want to hear any of this wartime nonsense. And she gets killed in 1 second. And I think it's very revealing, because this is the meaning of the movie. If you will be like her, if you will try to talk this thing over, and basically cover it with your isolationism, neutrality, you will get killed. This is the meaning of the movie. So I like the scene because, of course, it's unfair, because first of all, she's an older woman, and Hitchcock really likes to make fun of older women in his film. Mother of Robert, whatever his name is, in The Stranger of the Train, and Robert Walker, and those older funny ladies in parties, and we saw them in Farmer's Wife. So Hitchcock kills her and not anybody else. But it is a shocking moment. You don't expect this coming, and this is revealing. And this, I would say, points to the fact that Hitchcock really wants to say something with this film. If you stay with your isolationist ideas, if you try to neglect this war or to ignore it, this war will come and it will kill you. So everything happens later, including the interesting moral choice of a daughter betraying her father, because it's quite surprising. She still loves him. She knows that he's a traitor. I mean, the character of Laraine Day, the daughter of Fisher. But she says, yes, this is more important. The wartime effort is more important than my loyalty towards my father. Interesting scene. But yes, I would say that the single point of shock in the film is exactly this moment. Maybe also killing Van Meer's double on the stairs, which is such a obvious nod to Potemkin and Eisenstein's famous Odessa stairs, even including the bloody shot of a face, with blood on it, which is taken straight from Eisenstein, that you can tell that, it was inspired by this. But yes, I would say that this point, the shocking point here, is that this old lady is killed in front of our eyes, and this probably is the moment in which Hitchcock is most serious in this film.
I would agree, and of course this moment is another throwback to Hitchcock's earlier films, like The Man Who Knew Too Much, for example, this early killing when we need a few seconds to understand what has just happened. How was this man shot in this early scene in the mountains? That's very interesting what you mentioned about these moments of shock, and I would say there are not many of them here. When you compare this film with the intensity of Rebecca, Rebecca is not a violent movie, but it's certainly a very unsettling one and full of this very subdued horror. Here we are in a totally different environment, and I think this movie is waiting for our, maybe not reprisal because it's a Hitchcock classic, but for our renewed attention, because we are in the period when this talk about isolationism in the United States I think now we can really, and scholars can talk about it pretty openly. It's been 8 years ago, and such books and TV shows like Plot Against America, right, by Philip Roth and made into a TV show recently, TV series, they pretty openly tell about this very strong current of isolationism. Of course, in case of Hollywood, it's pretty complicated. It's maybe more complicated than simple politics because, of course, economy enters as well, foreign markets and so on. But we are rediscovering also early films that were saying no, isolationism is not a good prospect for anyone else in the world, not even for the United States, who are actually in a pretty privileged geopolitical situation, surrounded by two oceans and stuff like that. So they don't really have to fight, right? But from our Eastern European perspective, when we were waiting for our allies to start, campaigns, it's a different perspective. And I recently watched for the first time The Mortal Storm by Frank Borzage, who is another of these classical Hollywood directors who are being rediscovered nowadays. And Criterion even recently released his film Moonrise. And The Mortal Storm is set in 1933 in a German village in the south. We have James Stewart as a farmer, and Margaret Sullivan, who's just gorgeous. I mean, in the same year, they both start in The Shop Around the Corner. And there's also Frank Morgan. So we have the James Stewart, Margaret Sullivan, and Frank Morgan in these two films. And Shop Around the Corner is one of Lubitsch's loveliest movies. And The Mortal Storm is about this. It's a bit like The Garden of Finzi Continis, when we have this, the laws are changing very slowly, but they are inevitable. We know that Jews will have no rights very soon. We have this privileged overview as people who survived the 20th century, basically. So, and in The Mortal Storm, as I mentioned, released in 1940, we have this idea that this village in Germany is actually destroyed by the Nazis, and you cannot say no. And there is even, I think, one of the very earliest Hollywood depictions of a concentration camp, on the territory of Germany. So not of course, the death camps which appeared later in the 40s, but the concentration camps which were set by Nazis in the early 1930s, which is pretty incredible. I had no idea it's there. So there are these threads in Hollywood history that it's there. It's starting to be depicted. Confessions of a Nazi Spy and so on. So there is this current of anti-isolationist movies, which we can now watch to get the better perspective of what Hollywood was able to say at the moment, what it wanted to say, how did it balance the Hollywood's interests with nations and world's interests, right?
Absolutely, and I would say that, interestingly enough, directors that actually came from this part of the world, like Lubitsch, like Billy Wilder, I think had much deeper understanding of what was happening. Because if you look at even a film like To Be or Not to Be from 1942, or Wilder's films like Five Grays to Cairo, but later on Foreign Affair, not Foreign Correspondent. It's so clear that they had such a deep understanding of what exactly transpired, because they knew this world before it perished. They knew the strains of various political alignments, and they also partook in the horror of seeing a whole culture sort of turning against itself and destroying itself. Hitchcock doesn't feel this horror. I think he's a British man. He's on top of a great empire, but he does acknowledge that war is serious business, but he doesn't see a world perishing, and Wilder did, and Lubitsch also felt this, and this true horror is in their films. It's interesting. You could almost program an entire series of those innocent American reporters coming to Europe, or like discovering just how morally horrible the 20th century totalitarianisms are. I would say that you have Foreign Correspondent, You could also watch in this vein The Third Man, which is a much deeper film, which shows also this American innocent, Western writer played by Joseph Cotten, who comes to Europe and really learns what hell on earth is. Mr. Jones by Agnieszka Holland is another of those films which very late in the day but acknowledges the Soviet totalitarianism.
Reds by Warren Beatty.
Reds, yes.
A bit of a different.
Yes, exactly. I would recommend watching Reds and Mr. Jones on a single sitting. That's a good double feature of opposites. Julia, in a way, is another film.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to mention Fred Zinnemann, who was actually he was born in Rzeszów, not in Vienna, as most people thought up to recently, actually. And Fred Zinnemann was obsessed with the 1930s as this very unsettling period in European history. The period that led to a disaster, to actually like a hell. And he felt that. And, Seventh Cross, his 1944 movie, is another early depiction of concentration camp fugitives, actually, with Spencer Tracy. So, yeah, Fred Zinnemann was another of these Central European filmmakers like Wilder.
Mm-hmm. It's such a wide subject, wartime films, but let's just for the moment notice that Hitchcock enters this area. The war has just begun. It will stay for the next 5 years, and Hitchcock will come back to it. However, the next time we will find him in an entirely different mode, in a film called Mr. and Mrs. Smith, starring Carole Lombard, which will be a screwball comedy of all things, and I'm really looking forward to revisiting this film, which I haven't seen in years. So, any final word on Foreign Correspondent?
No, I think that's all. I think we'll be coming back to the topic of war, certainly, and we'll give you more details. Also about Hitchcock's unorthodox projects like German concentration camp survey, right? Another one of them, or his shorts during the war. But it will come soon. Now, in the next episode, a complete change. Hitchcock wants to show that he's a pretty diverse director. And yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. We both love screwball comedies, so we're looking forward to that.
Yes, I'm truly looking forward to that. And I don't know if I'm allowed to mention this. No, I probably not. But I was just saying that you are about to become a married man, and this is a film about marriage.
That's pretty public. Yeah. I'm getting married in November 2021.
And this is a film about divorce.
Yeah, but we're watching many of them. Recently, believe it or not, me and Patricia, my fiancée, we staged a picture which was inspired by Adam's rib. So we learn from these movies how to survive different crises.
Okay, was the picture depicting a sauna?
No, just two people on the bed.
Oh, wonderful. The comedy of remarriage, as Stanley Cavell said. That was just a personal aside, but yes, next time, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please like us on Facebook, Foreign Correspondents, Deeper into Hitchcock podcast, and share if you like this episode. Please share, and we hope that this podcast will bring you some Hitchcock joy. Thank you so much. This was another episode of Foreign Correspondents.
Deeper into Hitchcock.